Yeah, talking freedom and liberation. Worldwide, not just only for the nation. A radical guide.
Welcome to a special edition of A Radical Podcast. We are stepping outside our usual format to address the patterns of state violence, political distortion, and movement suppression unfolding around us. With the current state of the world, ICE targeting schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods across Los Angeles and the country, arresting, deporting, and tearing families apart, with houseless encampments being raided and cleared, and unhoused community members forcibly deported, I've been thinking a lot about how these acts of violence are not just carried out, but normalized. I'm seeing an increased pattern of dehumanizing resistance efforts, especially those aimed at protecting communities from state violence. And when I talk with people who aren't part of these struggles, it's clear that we're not working from a shared understanding. There's a widespread belief that the political right, the center, and the liberal or neoliberal left fundamentally differ. But these factions play a similar role when it comes to protecting power and suppressing resistance. And if we can't name that, it becomes harder to build the kind of movements that actually challenge domination. In this episode, we'll explore these political labels: liberal, neoliberal, leftist, and anarchist, and their roles. These terms are often used interchangeably, sometimes as insults, sometimes with confusion, and sometimes as if they all mean anti-Trump. These distinctions matter, not because they divide us, but to help create a shared understanding. That clarity lets us talk with our communities about what we're up against, how power works, and how we build resistance that doesn't get absorbed back into the very systems we're trying to dismantle.
Let's go.
Let's start with liberalism. Liberalism prioritizes individual rights, civil liberties, and reform through electoral and legal systems. It believes the system works, or can be made to work better, through policy changes, court rulings, and voting. Liberals support civil rights legislation, diversity in leadership, and regulated capitalism. But liberalism doesn't challenge the underlying systems that produce inequality. It doesn't question capitalism, police, or imperialism. Instead, it aims to make those institutions more inclusive. Liberalism often legitimizes the status quo. It tells people that if they just vote, lobby, or sue, justice will follow. Meanwhile, the material conditions for poor, Black, Indigenous, undocumented, and other marginalized communities remain violent and unstable. Police still kill, prisons still expand, borders still cage. Liberals might speak the language of progress, but the ground doesn't shift. To see how this plays out in practice, look at figures like Barack Obama. His presidency inspired millions with messages of hope and inclusion. But behind that rhetoric were policies that expanded drone warfare, oversaw record deportations, and bailed out Wall Street while leaving many working-class Black and brown communities behind. Or take Ruth Bader Ginsburg, widely respected for her stance on gender equality, yet she also voted in ways that upheld corporate power and narrowed protections for workers and incarcerated people. These aren't isolated contradictions. They reflect how liberalism operates. It grants representation while maintaining structure. It celebrates first while ignoring foundations. It invites marginalized people into the system, but rarely questions the system itself. Liberalism plays a similar role in many other countries, where it often functions to stabilize systems of inequality through symbolic reform and surface-level inclusion. In post-apartheid South Africa, for example, liberal democratic governance brought legal equality, but preserved deep economic disparities rooted in colonialism and racial capitalism. In Canada and Australia, liberal governments have embraced gestures of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples while continuing to expand resource extraction and militarized policing on Indigenous lands. Across Europe, liberal parties have passed anti-discrimination laws while upholding anti-migrant policies and surveillance regimes. These aren't failures of liberalism. They're expressions of how it operates when protecting the state remains the priority.
Radical education, yeah, a better future, what we really need, not rooted in capitalism.
Now let's look at neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic ideology that centers the market above all else. It pushes privatization, austerity, and deregulation. It says public systems should be dismantled or sold off. Healthcare, privatized. Education, marketized. Housing, left to landlords and developers. Neoliberalism isn't limited to the political right. It has shaped policy across the US and globally since the late 1970s. Democrats and Republicans alike have promoted it. Welfare reform, free trade agreements, charter school expansions, and public private partnerships, all hallmarks of neoliberal thinking. Social impact. Neoliberalism has gutted safety nets, fueled mass inequality, and reshaped our understanding of worth. If you're poor, sick, or unhoused, neoliberal logic blames you. It conditions us to compete rather than cooperate. And it normalizes the idea that corporations and billionaires can fix what they helped break. Neoliberalism became dominant in the US under Ronald Reagan, who slashed taxes for the wealthy, broke unions, and promoted trickle down economics. But it didn't stop there. Bill Clinton carried it forward, signing NAFTA, expanding mass incarceration through the 1994 crime bill, and dismantling welfare with the 1996 Personal Responsibility Act. The key point? Neoliberalism became bipartisan consensus. Whether through Republican deregulation or Democratic privatization, the logic remained the same. The market knows best. Neoliberalism isn't confined to the United States. It has been exported globally, often through violence and authoritarianism. One of the earliest and most devastating examples was Chile under Augusto Pinochet. After the US backed coup in 1973, Pinochet implemented sweeping neoliberal reforms, privatizing pensions, healthcare, and education, based on policies developed by economists from the University of Chicago. These changes were enforced alongside mass repression, torture, and disappearances. The model didn't stop there. Through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, similar policies were imposed on countries across the global south. Structural adjustment programs dismantled public services, removed labor protections, and deepened poverty, often leaving countries more indebted and dependent than before. These so-called reforms were marketed as economic progress, but their consequences have been devastating for working class and marginalized communities worldwide. Today, we see neoliberalism in policies that reward developers over tenants, treat education as a competition, and frame poverty as a personal failure rather than a systemic design. It's a logic that both major parties have reinforced, not because they misunderstood it, but because it maintains economic control and political stability for those already in power.
A radical guide, that's what this is. Highlighting the diverse world of resistance.
Now let's look at leftism. Leftism is a broad political tradition rooted in the rejection of capitalism and the pursuit of collective liberation. It encompasses a wide range of ideologies and movements: socialists, communists, anarcho-syndicalists, abolitionists, anti-imperialists, and others who seek to redistribute wealth, dismantle systemic oppression, and challenge the concentration of power in both private and state hands. What unites leftist politics is a focus on material conditions: who owns land and labor, who profits from exploitation, how are systems of race, class, gender, and empire used to justify domination. These questions have real consequences. They inform strategy, shape alliances, and determine how movements relate to the systems they're challenging. Historically, leftist movements have played central roles in worker struggles, land reform, anti-colonial uprisings, and resistance to fascism. The Russian and Cuban revolutions, the Zapatista uprising, Black liberation movements in the US, and decolonization efforts across the global South are just a few examples. Leftist traditions have at times aligned with indigenous sovereignty movements, particularly through shared struggles against capitalism, colonialism, and state violence. While distinct in origin and worldview, some indigenous-led movements have formed strategic alliances with leftist and anti-capitalist projects, especially when grounded in mutual respect and autonomy. Leftist ideas have also informed feminist movements and ecological resistance, particularly when rooted in anti-capitalist principles. In the US, leftist organizing, particularly by anarchists, socialists, and communist-aligned labor unions, helped build the labor movement, secure the 8-hour workday, and challenge segregation and redlining. Groups like the Black Panther Party, grounded in revolutionary socialism and Marxist theory, embodied a synthesis of socialism, self-defense, and community care, offering free breakfasts, medical clinics, and political education while resisting police violence. Around the world, leftist governments and movements have created systems of universal healthcare, mass literacy campaigns, and worker cooperatives. At the same time, not all leftist projects have been liberatory. Some replicated the hierarchies they aimed to dismantle. For example, in the US, Liberal and progressive administrations have at times expanded carceral systems and surveillance infrastructure under the guise of reform, creating new forms of control while claiming to dismantle old ones. Others prioritize state power over grassroots democracy, silencing dissent in the name of unity, such as when radical voices were pushed out of broader coalitions in the civil rights era, or when Black and Indigenous organizers were sidelined in favor of institutional legitimacy. Acknowledging these contradictions doesn't weaken leftist politics, it sharpens them. In a time when those in power work to collapse distinctions and control the narrative, clarity about liberatory practice and principled struggle is essential. Reckoning with past failures isn't about reforming the politics of the left, it's about protecting them from being stripped of their radical potential. When grounded in autonomy, internationalism, and collective care, leftist organizing remains a powerful force for liberation. And in many places, that work is ongoing, led by those who refuse to separate survival from solidarity.
Let's go.
And then there are anarchists. Anarchism isn't left, right, or center. It rejects the whole framework. Rather than trying to take state power or shift it from one party to another, anarchism is about dismantling systems of domination, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, the state, and colonialism, and building relationships rooted in autonomy, mutual aid, and collective care. It's not a single doctrine, but a tradition of resistance built through action. Anarchists organize horizontally. They don't wait for permission. They build what's needed: food distribution networks, political education spaces, free clinics, housing takeovers, and neighborhood defense. These aren't side projects. They are everyday forms of survival and solidarity that challenge how power is structured. Anarchist practice is deeply rooted in direct action, blocking evictions, resisting fascist violence, sabotaging environmental destruction, and defending community spaces. But it also shows up in the quieter, consistent work: childcare collectives, prisoner support, and skill shares that strengthen collective autonomy. Globally, anarchism has shaped struggles from the Spanish Civil War and Korean independence movements to indigenous autonomy efforts in the Philippines and southern Mexico. In the US, anarchists were central to early labor organizing, the fight for the 8-hour workday, and the anti-globalization movement. More recently, they've organized mutual aid during climate disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic, often responding before the state ever arrived, if they arrived. Anarchists have long been painted as dangerous, not just by the state, but by liberals, conservatives, and neoliberals alike. When movements reject centralized power altogether, they become a threat to everyone who benefits from it. That's why anarchists are often portrayed as chaotic, violent, or unserious. These labels aren't rooted in fact. They're part of a coordinated effort to discredit and isolate anti-authoritarian movements that expose the limits of electoral politics and reform. That narrative helps justify repression. Across the political spectrum, liberal, conservative, and neoliberal, anarchists are portrayed as threats to order precisely because they refuse to legitimize the systems others seek to control. By rejecting centralized authority, they unsettle every claim to power, exposing the limits of reform and the violence behind state legitimacy. As a result, anarchists have been heavily criminalized, surveilled, infiltrated, and targeted by state violence. From COINTELPRO's attempts to dismantle Black and anti-capitalist movements in the 1960s and 70s to post-9/11 counterterrorism efforts that branded animal rights and earth defenders as domestic terrorists, the state has responded to anarchist organizing not because of violence, but because of the threat it poses to entrenched authority. Anarchism isn't a moral position. It's a practical stance against domination. It refuses to trade one form of control for another and asks how we can build relationships and infrastructure that don't rely on coercion. Liberation isn't measured by who gets to hold power, but by whether power is shared, accountable, and rooted in consent. Mutual aid, collective care, and horizontal organizing are declarations that another way of living is possible and is already happening.
Let's go.
Far-right movements have spent decades weaponizing political labels, collapsing every form of opposition, from reformist liberals to revolutionary anarchists, into a single imagined threat: the radical left. This phrase has been used not only in the US, but globally by authoritarian leaders and right-wing parties to paint all dissent as dangerous. In the US, presidents like Nixon, Reagan, and Trump used it to attack civil rights movements, labor organizers, and anti capitalist activists. Around the world, it's been used to justify repression in Brazil, the UK, France, and beyond, collapsing diverse struggles into one cartoonish villain. This tactic isn't a misunderstanding. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain control. The goal is to discredit dissent, criminalize resistance, and justify repression. By erasing the differences between those who seek modest reforms and those working to dismantle entire systems of oppression, the right creates a convenient enemy, one that can be surveilled, banned, and attacked without public backlash. Liberals are called communists. Anarchists are labeled terrorists. Teachers demanding fair wages, climate defenders blocking pipelines, or mutual aid organizers feeding neighbors are all cast as dangerous. The narrative is simple. Any resistance to state violence, corporate power, or white supremacy becomes a threat to law and order. This strategy has deep roots. In the post 9/11 era, anarchists, animal rights activists, and earth defenders were branded as domestic terrorists under the guise of national security. During the uprisings after the police murder of George Floyd, the state surveilled mutual aid kitchens, medical teams, and street organizers, treating care work as subversive. The message was clear: support your community outside state control, and you become a target. This tactic doesn't begin or end with the far right. Liberal and neoliberal institutions often adopt similar strategies. Collapsing distinctions between movements when doing so helps protect the system's legitimacy. By folding all resistance into one generalized extremism, they create the conditions for bipartisan crackdowns on protest, increased policing, and expanded surveillance. The real threat, though, isn't the people challenging injustice, it's the violence those people are responding to. Police killings, environmental collapse, forced displacement, and economic abandonment don't spark the same alarm. The crisis becomes those who resist, not the conditions they're fighting. This reframing is intentional, shaped to distort public perception and delegitimize grassroots resistance. A soft counterinsurgency strategy designed to obscure liberatory movements, make their demands illegible, and keep power exactly where it is.
A radical guide, that's what this is. Highlighting the diverse world of resistance.
As mentioned before, the right isn't the only force collapsing political nuance. Liberal and neoliberal institutions do it too, just through a more polished vocabulary, often cloaked in civility and consensus. Liberalism is often treated as the outer boundary of acceptable discourse. When movements push further toward abolition, anti-capitalism, or collective autonomy, they're often labeled as unrealistic, divisive, or even dangerous. These dismissals aren't coming from far-right platforms, but from mainstream media, professional nonprofits, and party leaders who claim to represent progress. We see this repeatedly. Calls to defund the police are reduced to slogans and framed as threatening public safety, even by liberal politicians. Mutual aid projects are celebrated during crises, but stripped of their radical roots and repackaged as feel-good charity. Direct action is applauded when it stays symbolic, but condemned when it disrupts. Anarchists are ignored or vilified until their organizing becomes too visible, at which point they're blamed for unrest. And terms like grassroots are routinely hijacked by top-down campaigns to mask their corporate or state backing. This framing isn't accidental. It functions as a strategy to contain resistance and protect existing power structures. Liberal institutions often absorb movement language and visibility while sidelining the demands that actually challenge power. Commissions, task forces, and summits offer recognition without redistributing control. Policies get softened, messages are rewritten, and organizers are asked to compromise in the name of access and unity. Neoliberalism reinforces this dynamic through institutions that claim objectivity while maintaining the economic and political status quo. Think tanks, grant foundations, and media conglomerates play both sides, highlighting protest culture one day, giving airtime to police unions the next. Philanthropy funds community empowerment only when it poses no threat to capital, and elite universities sponsor forums on justice while profiting from prison labor or fossil fuel investments. This selective amplification shapes what people believe is possible. It limits imagination to small reforms and sidelines transformative politics. It tells us that safety comes from surveillance, that justice is procedural, and that hope must always be incremental. But movements rooted in mutual aid, anti colonial struggle, and collective self determination don't wait for permission. They build legitimacy in action, in community defense, in refusal, in solidarity. That's the kind of legitimacy liberal and neoliberal frameworks can't co opt because it doesn't rely on them to exist.
Let's go.
The political center and far right use different tactics, but both work to preserve systems of domination. One stabilizes through symbolic reform and institutional absorption. The other relies on open repression, surveillance, policing, border militarization. Together, they enforce the boundaries of what's politically acceptable, keeping true transformation off the table. This matters because when we fail to recognize the shared intent behind these approaches, our resistance becomes easier to diffuse. Movements get redirected into policy tweaks and electoral cycles. Revolutionary demands are rebranded as unreasonable. Reform becomes the end goal instead of a step toward deeper change. We see this clearly in bipartisan support for police expansion, militarized borders, and global warfare. These aren't just policies, they're tools to protect the same systems we're trying to dismantle. Treating neoliberalism as a partisan issue obscures how deeply it's embedded across governance. Ignoring anarchist and anti-authoritarian movements in this context means missing the most consistent efforts to resist absorption: mutual aid, housing takeovers, community self-defense, and direct refusal of state control. These distinctions shape how we organize, where we focus energy, and who we stand beside. Without that clarity, we risk fighting symptoms instead of systems. But with it, we can build resistance that isn't just reactive, but grounded, strategic, and unshakable. Liberation won't come from above. It's built from below, through struggle, care, and collective refusal.
Let's go.
As we have explored, distorting political labels is a deliberate tactic used to fragment movements and isolate organizers from one another. Recognizing this manipulation isn't just a matter of understanding, it's a necessary step in defending our collective work. Clarity alone isn't enough. It must be tied to action that reinforces solidarity and challenges systems of control. So, what can action that challenges systems of control look like? Start where you are, but be clear about what you're building toward. Join mutual aid networks that redistribute resources without strings attached. Support tenant unions that organize beyond legal reform. Connect with abolitionist efforts, dismantling carceral structures and building real alternatives. These projects go beyond feel-good gestures or charity. They are grounded in resistance, collective survival, and a refusal to rely on systems that continue to harm us. Build structures of accountability that don't rely on state validation. That might look like community assemblies, harm reduction teams, or neighborhood defense groups. These forms of care and coordination are how we build power, not just respond to crisis. Refuse the dilution of radical demands when liberal, neoliberal, or right-aligned institutions, including nonprofits, public agencies, and media platforms, co-opt movement language while reinforcing systems of domination, name it. When mutual aid becomes branding, or when direct action is softened to appease funders or political gatekeepers, that's containment. These tactics don't just dull the impact of our work, they actively preserve the structures we're fighting to dismantle. We need to stay vigilant and name these dynamics clearly, not to gatekeep, but to protect the integrity of movement building. Ground yourself in movement history, not to reenact it, but to understand the conditions people faced and the strategies they developed in response. These moments offer lessons, not formulas, tools we can adapt, challenge, and evolve as we organize today. From the Zapatistas to the Montgomery bus boycott to indigenous land defense, history shows what becomes possible when people stop waiting for permission and start building power on their own terms. More than anything, build trust. Liberation doesn't come from branding or influence. It's built on relationships, on people showing up, holding each other accountable, and organizing beyond the spotlight. This work is real, urgent, and unfolding every day. In community kitchens, on deportation blockades, in tenant meetings, and through acts of mutual aid. It's rooted in the tangible efforts people make to care for each other, challenge injustice, and survive systems designed to marginalize them. Thanks for being here. If you've stayed with us through this episode, you know these labels aren't just about language. They shape how power moves, how resistance is framed, and whose stories are erased or amplified. Today's conversation went beyond definitions. We looked at how power protects itself, how systems adapt to suppress resistance, and how political labels get weaponized in that process. From the far right to the political center, institutions erase nuance, treat dissent as disorder, and respond to resistance with either absorption or punishment. Understanding that helps us organize with intention, building collective power, disrupting control, and sustaining liberatory practices. Whether you're questioning what you've been taught, organizing for collective autonomy, or building alternatives, you're not alone. People everywhere are refusing the frameworks handed to them and creating new ways to live, organize, and care for one another, often outside of institutional permission or recognition. Until next time, this has been a special edition episode of A Radical Podcast. Thanks for joining us, and remember, follow ideas, not people.
Yeah, talking freedom and liberation. Worldwide, not just only for the nation. A radical guide, it's time to make changes. Bringing interviews and radical education. Yeah, a better future, what we really need. Not rooted in capitalism or supremacy. Yeah, trust, you don't want to miss it. We bring the truth right to you, the past, present, and future. Let's go. A radical guide, that's what this is. Highlighting the diverse world of resistance. Let's go.